Support for Swan Song is brought to you by viewers like you. Thank you. It sure has been a year of milestones for the Swan Song video project. Between celebrating the 25th anniversary of the WonderSwan, reaching the midway point in the combined WonderSwan and WonderSwan color library, as well as reaching the 100th game chronologically, there's been a lot to celebrate. Not to mention, the subscriber base has almost doubled with a third of the year left to go. Whether you're a longtime fan of the series or a relative newcomer, thanks for sticking around for the journey. I've been wanting to do a retrospective type video like this for quite a while. Back in 2018, before the series went on hiatus, the plan was to do a 1999 year in review after the calendar year of games was done, but I completely forgot about that when the time came to do it. I only remembered this week while I was backing up old scripts before Microsoft would wipe my entire OneDrive for inactivity. Earlier this year, the plan was to do some sort of episode 100 livestream, but unfortunately it's a bit of a logistical nightmare to schedule. Well, anything this fall, so a pre-recorded video like this is really all I can manage. Sorry if you were looking forward to that. The underlying goal of the video project is to put into question and reassess the Bandai WonderSwan's negative reputation amongst Western gamers to find out if its reputation is rightfully earned. And to be perfectly clear, I didn't start this video series with an ulterior motive. I'm not out here actively trying to redeem the WonderSwan in any way. I got the idea to embark on this project before I had ever played a WonderSwan game myself, and I'm developing my opinion on its library in real time in front of the viewers. Before I reveal how I feel about the first 100 games on the WonderSwan in aggregate, I would love to know what longtime viewers of the series think my opinion about the WonderSwan library is going to be. So if you feel like playing along, please pause the video and post your guess in the comments. I swear this sounds like I'm baiting for comments just to juice the algorithm, but I'm actually curious how my opinion comes across in my videos. There is a fundamental issue with the premise of reassessing the reputation that the WonderSwan got, and that's the passing of time. If we rewind to the web of the early 2000s, Western commentators on the WonderSwan library would be evaluating it in a very different context than the one we live in today. Outside of PC shareware titles, video games were mainly distributed as physical products in a store, and for most people, your gaming choices were limited by what you had physical access to locally. The bar the WonderSwan had to meet at the time was high, because accessing the WonderSwan at all meant going out of your way to import a device from Japan, and in most cases pay quite a bit of markup over the Japanese street price. In that context, if you were unable to read Japanese, I don't think there was really anything within the first 100 WonderSwan games that stood out enough to warrant going through the trouble of importing a system and games at the time. If you were able to read Japanese and enjoyed Gundam and other mecha franchises, then the system got a bit more enticing thanks to the presence of beloved mecha strategy RPGs, Super Robot Taisen Compact, and the Compact 2 trilogy, as well as SD Gundam Gashapon Senki and SD Gundam G Generation Gatherbeat. If you are already sold on the idea of playing strategy RPGs while on the go, then the WonderSwan offered a much nicer experience for those kinds of games than what was available on the Game Boy at the time. I think this particular niche could be convinced to pick one up. At a high level, I don't blame Western gamers for their disinterest in the WonderSwan at that time, because the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze. But just because something isn't worth it doesn't mean it's inherently trash. Not being able to differentiate these two things is ultimately what I take issue with, and it led to overly dismissive takes on the WonderSwan's library to propagate like wildfire. Back in the modern day, thanks to the internet, digital game distribution, and a booming emulation scene, access to almost all of video game history is at everyone's fingertips. Unless you're a purist wanting to play on original hardware with original carts, access to the full WonderSwan library can be yours for free within a few seconds. But don't forget that this is inherently true for most other video games released, and now we're in a weird situation where WonderSwan games are now competing for your time and attention with every other video game ever released. So this puts us in a different awkward position. In a world where video games are abundant and essentially free, is there anything notable enough on the WonderSwan to break through to making it onto your backlog? Well, we're all going to have different answers. In a world of abundance, you need to actively curate what you want to consume. We all have different brainworms, we are all drawn to vastly different styles of games, and recognizing what aesthetic, mechanical, and/or narrative elements that we resonate with and want more of in our lives is the key to a happy gaming life. Swan Song videos are not trying to dictate the one true take about all of these games. Yes, I say what I think and feel about these games, but I don't think my opinion is truly what's valuable about my videos. I think sharing the context around each of these games, trying to identify what the developers were setting out to do, and giving you enough of a feel for what's special about a game to extrapolate if you're personally interested enough to play it is what's most valuable. Speaking purely for myself, I can count the number of WonderSwan games in the first 100 release that I care about enough to play more of after completing their videos on a single hand. There's probably a dozen other games that I thought were neat ideas, whose execution was flawed enough in ways that deterred me from wanting to play more. That said, I do think things are going in a positive direction for the WonderSwan game library. 1999 was mostly about checking all the boxes and ensuring there was something in the library for every type of player, even if they were mostly Game Boy ports or easy cash grabs. Early 2000 is really when that kind of filler software slowed down considerably and we started getting a consistent stream of original but mostly flawed titles. Within a few months we'll be entering the WonderSwan Color launch window, and I can say that some of the titles that I'm most interested in are titles from the Color era. Just because my opinion of the first 100 isn't glowing doesn't mean that the remaining 98 games are going to be doomed to be stinkers. Next up, I want to shout out a few episodes from the first 100 that are my favorites. Especially early on, I noticed that some of the episodes that I liked the most didn't do particularly well. I think people are just more likely to click on games that they recognize than titles they know nothing about, but sometimes the really boring seeming episodes have the wildest stories. Let's start off with Go Raku o Tango, episode 13. I was worried about this one because it was the first game in the series where the game completely depends on knowledge of the Japanese language, and I wasn't convinced that I could find enough to say about it that would make sense to people who aren't already familiar with the Japanese syllabary. Luckily, while I was researching the origin of the game and its developer, I found out that it had a crazy backstory involving the dissolution of Panasonic's in-house development studio for 3DO games. That really taught me that the most unsuspecting games can have the wildest stories to share, and it really underscores the importance of research in making these videos interesting and educational. Next episode I really like was the last episode I released before going into an unplanned hiatus for many years, and that was episode 61 on Fever Sankyoko Shiki Pachinko Collection for WonderSwan. I have a bit of a reputation amongst my friend group for being fascinated by all facets of Japanese gambling, and this episode really was my chance to use that obsession to deliver a high-level overview of what pachinko is to an audience that likely already had an innate hatred for pachinko despite not knowing much about it. I think events like Konami taking time away from the consumer gaming market to focus on the pachinko market a few years ago really damaged the reputation of pachinko amongst Western audiences, with it held as the boogeyman for much of what went wrong with the Japanese gaming industry throughout the 2010s. I think the situation at the time was far more complicated and nuanced than that, and I think shifting to pachinko is merely the outcome of that, not the underlying cause. Also, just so I'm not misunderstood, I think gambling is an incredibly predatory industry, but I do find the intersection of legal and gameplay systems at play in pachinko to be a fascinating rabbit hole to dive into, and I think many pachinko machines actually provide a lot of entertainment value that makes them appealing outside of their use as purely gambling apparatus. Maybe I should touch on this in a future one-off video. Episode 65 on D's Garage 21 Kobo game Taneo Makutori was a fun one to work on because the game began as a design document submitted to a TV show's game design contest and was developed in public with regular updates on the television show. It was really cool to track down these episodes of D's Garage 21 and watch the game being made in real time and see rare footage of how developers use their WonderSwan dev kits out in the field. It was also a really nice opportunity to watch some nostalgic 1999 Japanese television and really immerse myself into what the cultural context was like at the time. Episode 69 on SD Gundam Gashapon Senki Episode 1 was pretty important to me because it's the first Gundam game after that multi-year hiatus that I got to cover, and if I'm being honest, it's also the first Gundam game that I really gave a fair shot to. As I mentioned on the more recent episode about G-Generation Gather Beat, it's during that hiatus that I made an active effort to become more familiar with Gundam as a franchise and really grew to appreciate it through playing games like G-Generation F on the PlayStation. I also think this game was a really poetic ending to 1999 given how important Gundam is to the WonderSwan as a whole. Last up, I want to bring up the WonderSwan 25th Anniversary Special that I released back in March. This was the first video in the series to feature live action footage of real WonderSwan hardware shot on my Sony Alpha 6700. And it took a lot of effort to get done in time, considering I was in Japan for the 3 weeks prior to release. It actually came out while I was on the plane ride back to Canada. I totally miscalculated how much effort would be necessary to shoot this video, and it came down to a big crunch in the last week before my Japan trip in early February. I ended up needing to reshoot a few scenes because a few shots didn't hold up when they were viewed on a bigger screen. It actually wasn't in the original plans to use an overhead camera shot of the hardware at all, but I wasn't able to get the shots that I originally wanted while adequately lighting the screens, so everything would be intelligible. Ultimately, I think it came out for the best with the overhead shots because it made the video feel relatively consistent from one shot to the next, and I don't think I would have been able to have that kind of consistency had I gone with the original plan. It was an interesting experiment, and I do want to do more episodes focusing on hardware in the future if I can afford to do them, because WonderSwan hardware is getting more and more expensive. That about does it for what I wanted to share on this retrospective. If you're a regular viewer of the series, thanks for sticking around. We have a really cozy vibe in the video comments, and I'm really grateful that even with the growth that the channel has seen over the last year, we still haven't lost that yet. That's really cool, and I really hope it stays that way as long as it can. One of the weird quirks of having taken a multi-year hiatus due to burnout is that the WonderSwan enthusiast scene has evolved quite a bit over that time. The state-of-the-art of WonderSwan emulation has never been better, there are finally viable solutions for TV out on real hardware, and there's just more people excited about the system trying to keep the homebrew scene alive long after its discontinuation. It's a great time to be a WonderSwan enjoyer. And on that, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next one.